Unshelling Medicine Podcast. Healthcare in the language we understand.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our episode today. It is certainly going to be very interesting. We are talking about the best computer in the planet, your brain. So I have the pleasure and honor to have George Haymaker with us. George is a neuroscientist, and we're going to discuss the neuroscience of change. So George is also a coach. He helps people understand and also educate people on understanding their brain and having a meaningful relationship with your brain. It's going to be interesting. Buckle in. So how to work with your brain to make your brain work better for you? Who doesn't want to do that? I do. So thank you for being here, George.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. And hello, everyone.
Yes, it's a beautiful day to learn. So the brain, George, what for the life of you interested you about studying the brain and human brain for that matter, which is a very complicated computer, to say the least? You know, what really shoved you or tugged you that direction?
Yeah, so you're right. The brain is our operating system, and I didn't understand anything about the brain before I got into it. And it's my sense that a lot of people just kind of take for granted what sits on their shoulders, and they don't really interact with it on a self-directed and self-guided basis to determine the outcomes that it gives them. They just kind of take what it offers. And what got me into it was a matter of necessity more than of interest. I have a history that involves addiction to pain pills and alcohol, and I have a lot of addiction in my family. I also grew up uncomfortable in my own skin with a lot of anxiety. And so I ended up coping with the mental discomfort with addictive substances. And that was kind of my life, my go-to for 30 years throughout my childhood and then well into my professional life, until addiction got the better of me and I hit a hard bottom in my early 50s. And I had to change. I had to figure out how to live life differently because I was at the end of the road. I was really in bad shape physically and mentally. And I was in rehab and really had to understand a new path forward. Otherwise, I wasn't going to make it. And so that's what got me interested in really opening up my mind to all kinds of possibilities. Up until that point, I had just been very much a matter of fact, kind of grind it day in and day out type of person and was all results oriented. I was in business and I was an entrepreneur and I was just starting and founding and building companies and not really thinking much about what was going on in my brain. I just accepted what was happening and it was uncomfortable and I was medicating with these substances and just trying to get by. So anyway, that's really what started my interest in opening up my mind to new possibilities, new ways of thinking, new ways of living. And that led me to the brain ultimately because, all these patterns that happen in our mental lives are in the brain at the neuron level. And for us to find better outcomes, find more beneficial mental activity, we have to understand how the brain works and how we can achieve better mental outcomes. And so that's really what got me interested in my own path to recovery. But then eventually I wanted to help others find their own roads to transformation as well.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much for sharing that beautiful story. And at 50, right? And there's this saying, you can't teach old dogs new tricks, right? At 50, somebody would say, you know what? I'm set in my ways. Leave me alone. This is my life. I mean, what else is there to change? But you decided to embark on a knowledge-based discovery of yourself and your brain. What was that knob? What turned that knob, or what was that driving factor to have you understand that there's more to life and there is more to you as a person? Granted, by measure of society, you succeeded, right? You founded companies, you're an entrepreneur, all of that stuff. What made you realize that, you know what, I've been scathing through life without really appreciating my brain and understanding it and making it useful?
Yeah, well, like you said, we don't have to change if we don't want to,
Absolutely.
and that's everyone's choice. In my case, I had to change or I was going to die.
Mm.
So it's really a matter of consequences for me. They had just piled up so high. My wife had left me and, I was kind of all alone at that point. And, maybe I guess to the outsider, I had achieved some success, but I just sure didn't feel like it. I was doing what I felt I was supposed to, so to speak, or striving for what I had determined was success, but it sure didn't feel that way. I wasn't comfortable in my own skin. I didn't feel good. I wasn't happy. So in my own case, and I think in a lot of people's cases, they wait until they kind of have to change before they're willing to. And there's a reason for that. And the brain is wired for predictability and safety. So even if what you're going through is not comfortable, the brain's number one job is to keep life predictable and keep us safe and surviving so that we can continue on the species. And so even if we're, like we have mental discomforts and lots of anxiety and we're not happy, the brain has determined through its experience with you that the way you've been leading your life has kept you alive to this point. And so the brain feels like it's done its job. Its job is not to make you happy or not happy. That's your job. Its job is to keep life predictable so that it can keep you alive. And so that's why change feels hard, is because, the brain wants to keep things the way that it understands it and knows your life, because it knows that it's kept you alive to that point. And for it to change, it has to go into a completely different direction. And it doesn't know yet that that's safe, that you'll survive it. It doesn't even know what that means yet. You may not even know what change means. And so that's why it's just hesitant to go along, and why change feels so hard is because the brain is designed to keep life predictable. So for me, I had to change. There was no choice. And so I guess that was kind of easy for me because, again, it was either reinvent myself or I wasn't going to make it. So, so that, started a process of not knowing what was next.
Right.
It was uncomfortable. It was hard. It was very difficult, I remember. But, I just opened my mind to new possibilities. I got into a 12-step program, AA specifically, and I just started doing what other people had were suggesting to me because they had been through it. They knew what it was like to recover from addiction. And so I just did what they said. And gradually, it started to work. I started to see some signs of improvement. And that allowed my brain to start being willing to come along with the process and engage in further and further change, because it began to understand that this new direction that we were going was going to be okay. It began to recognize that it was going to be safe and that I was going to survive it. And so it became willing to come along. And as things got better and better, it began to detect that there was reward in this new life. And that the brain also operates on reward. And so that's the reason why people that get addicted to substances get so addicted, is because the brain gets a lot of reward from these substances. And so what we need to do in addiction is wean it off of the reward from the substances and start to replace it with reward from natural life pleasures that it really hasn't enjoyed for a long time because it's been addicted to substances. And so it's a long process for the brain to begin to change its patterns to reflect a new way of living. And that's really what the neuroscience of change is all about, is it takes time and we have to begin to live a new way of living, and the brain will ultimately come along and change its neural patterns, its neural pathways inside the brain to reflect this new way of living.
Absolutely. That's so beautiful. So when you were going through your journey, having the sponsors in AA, people who had lived this life, experienced this, and have made changes in their lives, what was that feeling like when you encountered your first trigger? Because everybody does understand healing is not linear. You have your, hills and valleys, right? So what was that like, being confronted with your first trigger? And how did you deal with that? How was the fear, anxiety, and discomfort associated with that process? And how did you come out on the other side?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you a metaphor. And these patterns that we get stuck into, whether they're uncomfortable mental patterns, anxiety, or fear, or self-confidence issues, whatever it is, and addiction, which is also a pattern, are these get worn into our brains. They are neural patterns and pathways that get developed. They're connections of neurons, and they get strengthened over time. The more times that you repeat something, helpful or unhelpful, these patterns get reinforced and strengthened and stronger. And they're kind of like roots of a tree. And so if you think about an old tree in your backyard that has these really thick roots, those are like neural patterns in your brain that represent years of addiction, years of repeating the same negative thoughts over and over again, the same negative emotions. And most times these emotions and thoughts and behaviors are all wrapped up together in a pattern. And they all form like these roots, okay? And so the longer that we practice and reinforce these patterns, again, the stronger they get. And so what we're trying to do here is to stop engaging in these patterns. And then little by little over time, if we don't engage in them, they will weaken. So it's very much like if we stopped watering and fertilizing this tree with the thick roots, after weeks and months and eventually years, the roots of that old tree would begin to weaken, right? And that's exactly what we're trying to do with our brain. We're trying to plant a brand new small tree on the other side of our property, so to speak, which represents our new life, the new way that we want to live. So better thoughts, better emotions, better behaviors, ones that are free from addiction, ones that are built around natural life pleasures, ones that are built on making us feel good in healthier ways. Okay. And so then what we do is we practice these new ways over and over again. We build a whole life out of them. And if we practice them often enough without practicing the old ones, then little by little, we're watering and fertilizing the new tree. And so while the old tree is weakening, the new tree is strengthening. And really what this is we're transitioning from an old identity, which represents the old ways of thinking that aren't helpful to us. And we're moving over here to a new identity that we spend time outlining in detail. We understand what that new person's values are, what their psychological needs are. We get into great detail with how this person is constructed. And then we visualize that person. We begin to feel the emotions of what it's going to feel like when we get to be that person. And the brain begins to get used to that. And it starts this new root structure of the new tree, even if it's very so slight at the beginning. But the more times that we act and feel and think the way that this new person wants to think, feel, and act, then we are watering and fertilizing these neurons in the brain that represent these new small roots. And if you keep doing this fastidiously and regularly with lots of repetition, then in a matter of weeks and months, you will begin to transform over. Your brain will actually physically change to represent this new person. The problem that most of us have is that we don't stick with change long enough for those new roots to take hold. We don't water them enough. We don't fertilize them enough. We aren't motivated and committed enough to stay with it long enough for this new version of ourselves to begin to strengthen its roots.
So that you made a great point there, because I don't know if it's society. I don't know if it's human nature. I don't know what the factors are, but we are very quickly moving towards immediate gratification type of mindset. Nobody has time for delayed gratification. And most good things come out of delayed gratification, comes out of doing the work now, seeing the result over time. So where does that place us as a society where the hard work is boring? the hard work is not as shiny and pleasurable.
What you're describing is, in order for us to become truly the people that we would like to become, and maybe we already are, and if we are, that's fine. That's great. But if we're not, what we have to do is identify the roots of the tree, which are the basis of this new identity that we want to be. And we have to practice that new person over and over again. There's no other way. The brain will not, we will never become that person sustainably. We will never be that person automatically and autonomically. Our brain will never recognize us as being that person unless we do the hard work,
Right.
unless we do and you say it's hard work. All it is repetition over and over again. It feels hard at the beginning because the brain is resistant, because it doesn't know what that looks like until you begin to show it until you begin to show that life to the brain.
Right.
And so that's why all hard is that the front part of our brain, the conscious part, the prefrontal cortex, the part that has to think a lot, that uses a lot of energy, okay, that has to engage during the initial early phases of change. Clearly, once we learn something and it becomes habit and it goes to the back part of our brain, our subconscious, and it's automatic, we don't have to think hard anymore. That's why those things that are already back there, like brushing our teeth, riding a bike, none of those things feel hard. They're easy because they've already been repeated and committed to memory, and they've been repetition. And so all hard is staying with it long enough for it to move from the front part of our brain, where we have to think about it a lot, to the back part of our brain where it becomes automatic. And it just takes the brain time to get there. And so you're right that the brain that is delayed gratification. And so we have to teach our brain that is going to be worthwhile to wait, because the rewards are going to be greater ultimately, in the sense of greater meaning for us, greater purpose, more calmness, more tranquility, more peace, more serenity, more goodwill within us. There are other types of transmitters that we get as opposed to just dopamine. We get serotonin, we get endorphins, we get oxytocin. These are all transmitters that make us feel great, but they require us using our values and our identity, creating meaning in our lives, creating great relationships in our lives, things that aren't instant, right? So that's a choice we have to make. We can either, it's easy for our brain because it keeps it where it is. It keeps it in a place that it understands, gives it immediate reward by scrolling on the phone or doing or social media or something that gives it a quick little spike of dopamine. But is that the person that we want to be?
Yeah.
And are we going to be happy with that long term? Are we going to get to a point later in life where we're older, like me, and we're having to look at our life and say, am I happy going out of this world the way that I am? Or do I have regrets? And I got to that point in my life where I was 52 in a rehab center, a mess, and I did not want to go out that way. And so I, did the work, and many people do, to get to where they want to go so that they have this deep sense of gratitude and purpose and meaning in their lives, because they become that new person that they've always wanted to be.
Thank you for that. So motivation, right? Not to sound like the sound bites in the world, but a lot of humans have, especially in the beginning of a transformational change, have a need for extrinsic motivation, like your sponsors, AA organization. So how important is it for somebody who wants to establish a meaningful change, even if it's not an addictive behavior? They just want to maybe go back to school and improve their careers, or learn a trade. How important is it to have a support system or sponsor of sort, right? An extrinsic factor to help a person build that intrinsic need to continue to pursue a pattern of success in training their brain to continue on a path of positivity, I should say.
Yeah. In some cases, a lot of cases, I think it's very important to have that because we're all wired for social connection. Okay. We were given hardwiring as a species, which we all have, for things that are going to keep us alive and sustaining as a species. And so those are things like food, getting dopamine, which is the motivation. Dopamine is a motivating neurochemical. It keeps us pursuing things. And so we're hardwired to get dopamine for eating because we need to eat to live, for drinking water because we need to drink water to live, for having sex because we need to procreate the species for it to continue, and for social engagement. Because, way back in the day when we were cavemen and there were a lot of predators out there, we needed to band together in tribes in order to protect each other so that we could survive as a species and figure out, how to defeat the dinosaurs and so on. If we didn't need anyone else and we were all by ourselves, we wouldn't have babies and we wouldn't be able to fend off enemies. Okay. And so that's all hardwired in us. So we are motivated to have these connections in a variety of different ways. And so like AAs, just as an example, it's very healing and cathartic for people to band together in a group to try to accomplish a common goal, which is to get sober, right? Because when you're addicted, you feel very isolated, you feel very alone and desperate. And now all of a sudden you come together in a tribe of people that are all trying to accomplish the same thing. And it feels like you're not alone. And that has great motivating attributes to it that allow us to continue and stay motivated and stay in it for the length of time that it's going to take to transform. Okay. And that's the case, I think, with a lot of important change that requires time and that's going to be difficult, is having someone there on your side that you feel like is in it with you. It could be a coach, could be a sponsor, could be a parent, could be your spouse, whoever, that's helped keeping you accountable and that is providing, support in whatever way you need it. Again, these are all sources of motivation that keep you in the game, pursuing what it is you're trying to get to, okay, long enough to create enough repetition so that you can begin to take over for yourself and you don't need these external sources of motivation. Because at the end of the day, the motivation that's most influential on us is not the external, the drug or the alcohol or the phone or the car or the house or this or that. Have you ever noticed, like, you get one of those things and how quickly, the excitement comes and then it leaves you, right? It's very quick. And that is just a thankless world to be in because you're just always chasing this stuff, dopamine chasing, and it never stays with you. It's just endless. And so if we can begin to retrain our reward system to pursue and be motivated by intrinsic, not extrinsic, reward mechanisms, like if I go back to school and become a nurse, it is going to fuel and reinforce my values, my psychological needs, what I believe in, things like helping people, make a difference in the world. Okay, those are things that will fuel you from the inside out. And those are long-lasting, motivating, reinforcing characteristics that we can retrain our reward system in our brain to be motivated by, to shift out of these quick dopamine hits and really start to latch onto these intrinsically motivated goals and aspirations. And that's really what you're doing, is you're retraining a pattern. So the falling in love with extrinsic rewards, these, scrolling on your phone or this and that, is a pattern. And it becomes a neural pathway in your brain. It becomes one of those roots in the tree. Okay. And so the more times you do it, scroll on your phone or like go buy a new piece of clothing, you are reinforcing that old pattern. And so what we're trying to do is stop watering and fertilizing those activities and move over here and plant a new tree and start to reinforce new rewards that are intrinsically based.
Thank you. So let's talk about your work as a coach, right? You had your struggle, you went through the journey, you got to a place where you're like, this feels great. I need to use my experience to help others improve their lives or live the life that they want. What has been the one aspect of brain training that you've seen across, I don't know what your demographic looks like, but you've seen across demographic? What is the one struggle most of your clients have in letting go and growing?
Yeah, it's these patterns in whatever form that they are.
Okay.
And everyone's patterns can be a little different, right? And a lot of it is based on their early childhood experiences, right? When their brains were very moldable and they were beginning to experience life. And, a lot of us had upbringings that maybe weren't ideal. And there were environmental things that went on that made us uncomfortable. And we had to respond and react in any way we needed to at the time to survive. And so, like in my case, I got spanked a lot, physically disciplined. I had to move around a lot. Like every year I was in a new home, going to a new school, having to say goodbye to friends, meet new friends. There was some sexual abuse for some older boys, so on and so forth. And so I had to develop a way of being that would protect me at that time. And it involved getting very angry, being reactive, losing my temper a lot, being hyper defensive, hypersensitive, not feeling like I was good enough, so on and so forth. The problem then is that, these things that we experience early in life, we take with us because we are, think about it, watering and fertilizing them so much as a kid. These roots begin to take hold and they just stay with us into adulthood because we've never done anything to change them. Mm-hmm. And so now, as adults, we continue to practice them. The circumstances may be different a little bit, the situations, because we're no longer children, we're not getting spanked, but there's other things that we're seeing in our lives as adults that remind us of those experiences that we had when we were children. And in my case, I was still getting angry, still being hyper defensive, still being hypersensitive, the same reactions. Okay. And so that's what I see a lot is people that have these patterns. Could be any number of different things. They could be using addictive substances or they may not be, but they're stuck in them and they don't understand what to do. And so that's where I help is I explain what they are in the brain, how they got to be there. We go back into their past to find out where they started to develop. And we basically deconstruct these patterns and find out where they came from and why they came to be. And what happens is that the individual will begin to understand and get these insights and epiphanies that they now begin to understand. And the amount of weight that gets lifted off their shoulders just from the understanding of why they are feeling the way that they're feeling today because of what happened a long time ago is really life-changing for them. So then the question becomes, okay, how do we shift out of the pattern? Because remember what we talked about earlier in the podcast is we need to plant a new tree and begin to shift towards it. Before we can do that, we need to loosen the grip that this pattern has on us. So these patterns have been so repeated and they're so emotionally charged, and the emotional components of them are like the glue. They're the glue that holds them together and keeps us stuck to them. It's the emotion of them, okay? They come along with thoughts and actions and behaviors, but all those components are woven together, and it's the emotions that keep them really glued to us. And so we have to then find some evidence and some ways of looking at these patterns that loosen the grip that they have on us. And once the grip is loosened and we don't feel like we're as stuck to them as we once were, then we can begin to design new patterns, the way that this new identity of ourselves, of where we'd like to go to. What we do at that point is we find out what our values are, what our belief systems are, what our psychological needs are. We do testing. We actually build a prototype of this new person that we want to be. And then we say, okay, well, how would this new person want to act, think, and feel in these situations where I've been having these patterns? How would I prefer to be? Okay. And then we begin to practice those. And we draw a line in the sand and say, from this day going forward, we are going to be that person. And it's going to be weird because we haven't been that person before. And it's going to be hard because we're just starting and the brain doesn't know what any of this is. But we're going to have to stick with it. And that's where having a coach or someone like me helps, is because, they have someone to work with and kind of hold their hand through the early stages of the process and help design their life with them and help hold them accountable. And, and it's not a smooth ride always. It can be one step forward, one step back, two steps forward, because these old patterns are so strong that something will trigger us and we might get pulled back into an old pattern.
Right.
But then we stop and we say, okay, what just happened? And we recognize that we got pulled back into a pattern and we say, okay, that's okay. We don't want to do that anymore. So let's go back and rehearse some more, this new way of being. And what happens is that, in a matter of weeks and months, usually it's like if you stay tied into this new way of being for 90 days, you are going to notice halfway through, you begin to see some marked changes in how you are, your way of being. You don't see yourself engaging in these old patterns as much. Your brain is starting to get comfortable with this new way of being. It's starting to experience reward from it because it's a lot more pleasant. It's a lot more pleasant to not be charged with negative emotion, having negative thoughts, having negative behaviors, getting in fights with and arguments with people. Your brain likes it when it's more tranquil, calm, peaceful. Things are going well. Your life starts to get better. So it begins to build momentum. And before you know it, it becomes a lifestyle. And that's when you start to not think about it so much, and it begins to transfer from the front part of your brain to the back part of your brain. It starts to go to a place where brushing your teeth is, where riding a bike is, where it's automatic and autonomic. And that's what you're after, is to have this new version of yourself become automatic and autonomic so that you then have transformed. That's what transformation is. You've transformed from an old way of being into a new way of being, but there is no shortcut. It involves this type of deep-seated introflexion, getting rid of the patterns, but loosening the grip of those patterns, getting them detached from yourself, building new patterns and practicing them, feeling the reward from them, getting them reinforced, doing it long enough to where it becomes automatic.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. So how important is environment? So a person is engaged with you, a person has you for a coach. However, their home environment is not one that supports their journey. Their interpersonal relationship, be it with family or spouse or friends, group of friends, is not one that supports the journey this person has decided to embark on and is working hard to be this new version of themselves. So in a case like that, what should a person do in order to maintain their journey and really avoid, that one step back being 15 steps back from a 2-step forward?
Yeah, so these patterns are not just within us. They represent cues that often involve external things. So let's take drug addiction as an example. We might have friends that we do the drugs with. We have a dealer that's nearby. We probably have neighborhoods that we've traveled through that represent, going to get the drugs or doing the drugs or, on and on and on. Okay. And the problem is if we stay with those environmental cues, the old patterns keep getting triggered. Okay. And so it's very difficult to become something different when you have these cues all around you that represent old patterns. And so it's hard. And so oftentimes, changing the environment That's why I went to rehab. I got out of the world for 60 days so that I had enough time separated from all these cues and from the availability of drugs and alcohol for my patterns to begin to weaken and begin to find some new patterns that I could begin to develop and attach to. So it's hard. Yeah. It's far be it for me to tell anyone what to do, but it's a lot harder to try to change when you are being influenced by cues that are pulling you back into old patterns. Let me just say that.
That's very true. You can heal in the environment that hurt you. Whatever that hurt was, abuse of any kind, addiction of any kind, whatever it is, you cannot heal in that environment. And it's okay to detach yourself. It's okay to cut ties, burn certain bridges, for your peace of mind, for that healthy brain and well-being. And yes, people are not going to take kindly to it. You are going to be accused of changing and not being the whole you. It's okay. You're supposed to grow. Trees grow, grass grow, you grow. So you're part of nature. So, George, we have had quite a healthy conversation. And, just to round this conversation to a close, what would you say about functional addiction? You talked about your journey into the outside world. You were successful in being a founder and entrepreneur and everything most people aspire to be. You were successful in your own right. But I'm sure not everybody in your circle or business partners knew your struggle. And sometimes people sit in that comfort because they can successfully hide their addiction or their struggles. So what do you make of that behavior where people like, at least not everybody knows, I can conceal it well and, I can manage it well? What is the end result of that?
Well, not everybody that uses drugs and alcohol will become addicted. There are certain epigenetics, your environment growing up that will. So if you have adverse childhood experiences and you end up coping with those with substances, you are 4 to 5 times more likely to become an addict than someone that doesn't have that. And if you have a genetic predisposition to addiction, which means you have genetic markers that are predisposed that if they get expressed, those genes, through stress, pressure, epigenetics, you are also 4 to 5 times more likely to become an addict if you start using drugs and alcohol. So if you have one of those two situations or both, you are exponentially more likely to become an addict than not. And then if you start using drugs and alcohol as a child, so before the age of 20, the front part of your brain hasn't fully developed. And so what you can do is start to damage the development of that front part of the brain, which is meant to be the check and balance on the reward part of the brain. So it's meant to tell the reward part of your brain, this isn't a good idea. It's, it's supposed to control impulse control and make sense of what you're doing to try to put the brakes on your behavior, right? And so if you're using and drinking early on, you're damaging that part of your brain, so it never has the capability to put the check and balance on the reward part of your brain. So those early life circumstances play a great role in whether or not you're ultimately going to become addicted. Typically addiction is very progressive. The reward part of your brain gets hijacked by these chemicals. It's getting such larger amounts of dopamine from these substances than it can get from anything else in life and because the brain is attracted to reward, it begins to interpret these drugs as it needs them for survival. Because again, the brain is given reward for survival type things like food and water and sex and social connection. But now it's getting 5 to 10 times the amount from drugs and alcohol. So it links those to survival. And so it's always going to be attracted to the thing that gives it the most reward. And so, if you're going down this slippery slope and using these substances and your brain is getting more and more attached to them, and you do it long enough, and these patterns get strong enough, they're very hard to come back from. And, I like to say that, addiction is undefeated. Like there's no one that's ever outsmarted or outworked or outthought addiction, right? It wins every time. And so I just think it's, I was a high functioning addict. I was in the early stages, and eventually I crossed over a line where it was no longer impulsively using. I was now compulsively using. And no one's standing there with a street sign saying, hey, you're about to go over the line. Like it's just coming up upon you and you don't know it's coming. And you don't really care either, because by that point it's too late. And you are just, it's got a hold of you. And so I'm not in the business of telling anyone what they should do just because, that's not my role in life. But I just know from what I've seen in my own personal experience that telling yourself I'm a high functioning user of drugs and alcohol and I can handle it, maybe you can, but the statistics are not in your favor.
Okay. Thank you for that. So, George, where can our listeners find you if somebody's listening to this and they resonate with a lot of what you said and they want to reach out and work with you? Where can we find you?
They can find me at my website, which is georgehaymaker.com. And there's a link on there to schedule a free discovery call where we can talk for, 30 minutes and just find out what's going on with you and how I might help you. There's no pressure, no pitching. It's just, seeing if we're a good fit to work together. And then you'll find me on LinkedIn at George Haymaker.
Beautiful. So we'll make all of that available in the show notes. So in case you're wondering how to spell George's name correctly, we'll make sure you have the correct spelling. So all you have to do is click in and find him. So George, I usually have my guests or ask my guests to leave a few golden nuggets. I mean, if you have a bag full, we'll take it as well. Leave a few golden nuggets for our listeners based on the conversation we have today, just about training your brain, overcoming whatever obstacles you may be dealing with, and, living a fulfilled life.
Yeah. The first thing I'd say is a note of hope and encouragement that no matter where you are in your life, what you're experiencing, specifically mentally, the brain is very forgiving. I never knew this. I just thought that I was kind of stuck with my brain the way that it was and the outcomes that it was producing for me. But there's a concept called neuroplasticity, which is the 85 billion neurons that are in your brain are constantly moving around. The plastic part of it means that they're malleable, shapeable. And they will actually move around and form new patterns if you identify the patterns that you want to have in your life. And so what you're experiencing in your mind right now are just these patterns that are been worn into these neurons have formed these patterns, these pathways. And so you can change them, and the brain will move and shift in response to any type of change that you want to make. So that's the good news, is that you are not stuck with your mental activity the way that it is right now. So there's hope there. Secondly, your brain is there as your friend and your partner in life. And I don't feel like enough of us treat the brain with the care, kindness, and respect that it deserves, given all that it does for us. I mean, it's only 3 pounds and it has 85 billion neurons in it, and it uses 25% of your calorie intake every day. So 3 pounds, I weigh 260 pounds. My brain is 3 pounds, but it uses 25% of my energy. So, and we rely on it for everything that happens in our lives. So doesn't it make sense that we would do whatever we can to fulfill its needs and take care of it? And so I think that we should look at it differently. And I think a lot of us, here's another metaphor for you. I think that we kind of sit in the passenger seat of our life and our brains are driving the car, And we just kind of are going along wherever it says this is where we're going. When in reality, the brain belongs in the passenger seat, and we need to get out of the passenger seat, get in the driver's seat, and drive the car where we want it to go, and the brain will follow along. So that it's really our partner in our lives, but we also need to take care of it and fulfill its needs. Better sleep, better diet, nutrition, exercise, mindfulness, like taking breaks during the day to give it a rest. The brain only has about 90 minutes of time of focus in it at a time, and it begins to then fatigue and spend resources very quickly after that. So, we should give it breaks during the day to allow it to reset itself and recover, right? But none of us really understand that because we don't know how the brain works. So take the time, get to know how your brain works, establish a partnership and relationship with it, be kind to it, and help guide and direct it in whatever way that you want your life to go.
Absolutely. That was beautifully said. Get out of the passenger seat and get in the driver's seat. Your brain will go where you want it to go. It needs you to wheel and direct it. So great, great, great conversation, George. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for listening, everybody. I'm very grateful for you all. I'm grateful for you, George. And we'll make sure we have everything, George, in the show notes, and also look out for the LinkedIn newsletter that is going to highlight this episode. And, find George again, 30 minutes free consultation. Try it, see if it's for you. Everybody's not for you. Everything is not for you, but it doesn't hurt to at least have that conversation to see where it goes. All right. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it again. Thank you, George. Everybody take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Unshelling Medicine Podcast. If you want to stay up to date with the latest episodes, make sure to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to leave us a review. Follow us on social media at Altruistic Scribe on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. We share additional tips, updates, and health-related content that you won't want to miss. Have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes? Reach out to us at altruisticscribeco.com. We're always eager to hear from our listeners and tackle the health topics that matter most to you. Until next time, stay healthy and take care.